up, everyone? Hello. Today we are going to look at the U.S. entry into World War I. For your warm-up, you will have some posters to look at. I don't have them available on the slides right now. Once I get access to my Canvas course, I'll be uploading things like this. But this is essentially, they're going to be propaganda posters. You guys have heard the term propaganda before. You know that this is essentially a term used to describe messaging by someone in order to convince another group of people to have a certain mindset or view. So these propaganda posters will be produced by the US government trying to convince people to support the United States joining in the efforts of World War I and joining in the military, joining in conservation efforts, and things like that. There will be a few examples in the slide. Once you guys have your warm-up submitted, we're going to do these notes on the U.S. entry into World War I. We have war industries activity and then the exit ticket, which pertains to the question, the essential question of the day. How did the United States joining World War I impact their foreign policy? Remember, we've left off with the United States having a policy of neutrality. Remembers what neutrality is. Think about it to yourself. It's refusing to take sides in a conflict. What was George Washington's policy on neutrality? Remember from his farewell address? He didn't like getting involved in conflicts very much. He wanted to convince the United States to remain neutral. Have they followed that? Kind of gone back and forth. They keep returning back to the neutrality, and then something comes up they want to get involved in, and they just get involved with it. That might just happen with World War I. President Wilson was the president during World War I, and he really wanted to keep the United States neutral during this. Why would he want to do that? Probably because it would cost a lot of civilian lives, cost a lot of US tax dollars, US dollars, and neutrality was the policy that was more widely supported. Remaining neutral was proven easier said than done. As time went on, there grew more support for joining World War I. There were a lot of divisions within the United States as to what side of the war should be supported. For example, there were about 8 million German Americans living in the States. Many of them supported their old homeland of Germany. It was part of the Triple Alliance. Based on this, how do you think that other Americans might have treated German Americans during World War I? German Americans actually faced a lot of discrimination during this time period, from refusing to buy from their shops to being verbally or physically harassed out in the streets. There were also about 4.5 million Irish Americans. There was a lot of resentment over centuries of British rule that led many of the Irish Americans to support the Central Powers. Many Americans supported the Allies. Most who were not of German or Irish descent were supporting the Allies. There was a lot of common heritage and culture with England, and there was an age-old friendship with France since France helped the United States during the Revolutionary War. Propaganda was super influential in eventually creating more support for World War I from US citizens, but both sides in the war were using propaganda tactics. Remember from your warm-up, what is propaganda? It's one group trying to convince another group to have a certain viewpoint by producing certain images, posters, videos as time goes on, articles that convince somebody to have a certain viewpoint. The British were particularly skilled with propaganda, and they cut the transatlantic cable from the United States to the US so that they control the war reports within the US, that Britain controls the war reports. So obviously, what side is that going to favor? Britain's side, obviously. They're going to want to skew the story in their favor. There were British reports of German atrocities that helped sway the American public opinion on the side of the Allies. All right, let's review what causes of World War I in Europe did we discuss last time. Militarism, alliances, imperialism, nationalism, and the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Think about those a little bit more, tell me a little bit more, reference your notes. Make sure you understand the causes. American businesses oftentimes have really strong ties to the Allied powers. The Allied powers are mainly going to be Britain, at the time Russia, eventually the United States. Many American banks invested heavily in the Allied cause, and some pro-German banks lent around $27 million to Germany. So there was some financial support to both sides of the war. Eventually, a series of events led to the end of the United States policy of neutrality and the entry into World War I. If you were to guess, what kinds of events do you think could convince the United States to end neutrality and join the war? Take a second to make a guess. Let's find out. One of the causes of the United States wanting to join were German U-boats, German submarines. England had blockaded German ports and were intercepting merchant ships and forcing them into British ports for inspection. So in February 1915, Germany declared it would sink without warning any ship found in the waters around Britain. Why would they want to do that? They want to make sure that Britain doesn't have access to any supplies coming in through trade on the waterways from any other countries. A lot of those supplies were coming from the United States. So Germany was outraged. And Germany had previously signed an international treaty banning attacks on civilian ships without warning. This is something they've gotten in trouble with before, and they certainly don't want this to happen again. These little red diamonds are places where German U-boats were found sinking mostly British ships. This is Britain, so around the territory around their country. If you had the power to decide whether the United States should join World War I, would you join at this time when Germany violates the agreements regarding U-boats? If you're in class, we'll take a little vote. Not only the United States was pretty upset that their boats in general were getting sunk, but the Lusitania was one of the last straws. It was a British passenger ship, and on May 7th, 1915, a German U-boat struck the Lusitania, killing around 1,200 people, including 128 Americans. Americans saw this as a terrorist attack on their civilians. And this is when, even more so than just the general sinking of U-boats, the U-boats attack on ships, the Lusitania was the largest attack so far on American civilians. It was not even a military ship. It was like a tourist ship. It wasn't passenger ship. It wasn't even one carrying military supplies. Here's a newspaper article at the time. It was a very large ship, kind of looks like the Titanic, even like comparable in size. President Wilson was still refusing to declare war, even after the sinking of the Lusitania. He was still seeking neutrality. The U-boats continued to attack ships, such as a French passenger ship, the Sussex, injuring several Americans on board of that ship. And Wilson finally issued a last warning to Germany, calling an end to unrestricted submarine warfare. That term, unrestricted submarine warfare, essentially just refers to the random sinking of ships. Germany wants to avoid war with the United States and pledges to stop sinking merchant ships without warning. What do you guys think? Do you think they're actually going to stop? Well, let's find out. In the election of 1816, Wilson was reelected with the slogan, "He kept us out of war." Do you guys think he's going to continue keeping us out of war? What's the title of today's lesson? U.S. entry into World War I. So, probably not. This is the main turning point. You guys read about this yesterday. In January 1917, German official Arthur Zimmermann sent a telegram to Germany's ambassador in Mexico. This telegram promised a deal with Mexico. If Mexico joined Germany in a war with the United States, Germany promised to restore Mexico's lost territory in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. Remember, how did Mexico lose this territory? Mexican-American War. Do you guys think that Mexico is going to take Germany up on this deal that's presented in the Zimmerman telegram? Make a prediction? They will not, because United States finds out first. The British intelligence intercepted the letter and leaked it to the American newspaper, so everybody knew about Germany trying to go behind the United States' back to create another alliance that would directly threaten the US. The Americans were furious and concluded that war with Germany was now necessary. But what do y'all think? Do you agree that it was necessary after the Zimmerman telegram, or should they have held off longer? Held off longer. Here's another example of a newspaper. Germany seeks an alliance against the US, asks Japan and Mexico to join her. Full text of her proposal made public. Juicy headline. Here's a political cartoon describing the time. It says, join Germany and you get a bit of the United States. What country do you think this is supposed to represent? Mexico. To represent the Zimmerman telegram's message to Mexico, trying to convince Mexico to enter into a war against the United States. And of course, even after that, the unrestricted submarine warfare resumed again. So if you made the guess that they would not adhere to their promise and it would in fact continue, then you were correct. On February 1st, 1917, Germany resumed its practice of sinking all ships bound for England. Germany hoped to starve Britain of supplies, bring them into submission in a few months. Why might starving them of supplies cause them to surrender? Why is it important to have supplies? Like, they need food, they need their normal resources, but they also need the military supplies to fight properly in the war. In just under 2 months, German U-boats sank 6 American ships. Germany underestimated America's ability to respond quickly. But there are, of course, still some people who did not want the United States to join World War I. Why might some people not want them to join? For example, perhaps they're worried about the high risk of death, the death toll that might take on the country, the sacrifices that people will need to make sure that there's enough production going on for military supplies. Those are just a few of the reasons. But nevertheless, Wilson does decide to declare war on April 2nd of 1917. He appeared before a special session of Congress and says that the world must be made safe for democracy. That's his argument for joining World War I. How might joining World War I help to make the world safe for democracy? They're basically arguing that they want to help spread democracy by shutting down these countries who are trying to propel dictatorships. Congress passed the war resolution, which brought America officially into World War I. So tired, I'm sorry. So the overarching question here are, what were the 2 main causes of American entry into World War I? We've got unrestricted submarine warfare by Germany, which led to the sinking of passenger ships like the Lusitania, which carried American citizens on board, and the Zimmerman telegram, which called for Mexico to join Germany in a war with the United States. Why was the United States upset about these actions? We pretty much already covered it. Of course, they're upset about unrestricted submarine warfare because Germany had promised that they would stop this and then continued to participate in it nonetheless, killing American lives. And of course, they were upset about the Zimmerman telegram because they were deliberately trying to form an alliance directly against the United States. As time goes on, there's lots of efforts to organize the war effort. There are progressives in the government during this time, and they're applying their ideas of planning and scientific management to the war efforts. Who are progressives? We learned about them a few days ago. Progressives are people who are trying to make changes within the government. They're usually more focused on lower class people, trying to um, abolish monopolies and trying to make some changes in society. If you're progressive, you're somebody who wants to make a change. Therefore, the progressives in the government decided to create these things called wartime agencies to coordinate between the federal government and big businesses. These emphasize cooperation between the two in order to meet wartime needs. How do you all think that the government and private industries might be able to work together to create something that might be in need during a time of war? Make some predictions. Let's see. You guys are going to take just a minute to design your government agency that you would create to support the war effort. Take a minute, think about it. What does your agency do? What is it meant to serve? What kinds of groups of people is it meant to serve? How are you going to get funding for it? These are some of the ones that did actually exist. We've got the War Industries Board. This was established in July 1917 to coordinate the production of war materials. What are examples of war materials? Those would be, think about it for just a second. Those would be military weapons, perhaps ships, war clothing for those in the military, um, other forms of transportation. The War Industries Board also told manufacturers what they could produce in order to preserve materials when necessary or to use those materials to create as many products as possible for other items. Sorry. They also allocated raw materials to businesses, created new factories, and set prices. We also have the Food Administration, run by future President Herbert Hoover. He was responsible for increasing food production and worked to reduce civilian food consumption. His slogan was, "Food will win the war, don't waste it." He also encouraged families to plant victory gardens, and part of his campaign was called Hooverizing. He campaigned for wheatless Mondays, meatless Tuesdays, and porkless Thursdays. This encouraged people to further preserve food and make sure that food would be available for the troops. Do any of you have a rule at home that you have to finish your plate before you are allowed to leave the table? A lot of those types of family rules originated from this time period. It was very much the norm that there would be no food waste during this time. Here's an example of a piece of propaganda that the Food Administration might have produced. Victory is a question of stamina. Send the wheat, meat, fats, sugar, the fuel for fighters. United States Food Administration. So they're essentially saying like there's not a ton of food to go around since the government is buying a ton more than they normally do, getting prioritized with that food supply. And a lot of the farmers are off in the military, so there's less people producing these foods. So they're asking the American public to prioritize the military receiving these foods. Here's another one. Please do not order bacon. If you do, some soldier boy at the front has to go without, just that much. And he might be your soldier boy too. So they're trying to convince people not to buy too much food and trying to say that if you don't buy as much food, the military, your soldiers, your dad, your brother, your husband might be able to have a little bit more. I just covered this recap. Why is there a shortage on food? Because the government is buying a lot more than they used to. There's less production available with the farmers, many of the farmers at war, and there's just not enough to go around. Here's another piece of propaganda from the Food Administration. Food will win the war. You came here seeking freedom. You must now help to preserve it. Wheat is needed for the Allies. Waste nothing. So this is using the symbolism of the United States to try to convince people that it's not taking away your freedom to ask you to sacrifice food. It's helping to preserve that freedom by supporting the war effort. We also have the Fuel Administration, which managed the nation's coal and oil use. It also established daylight savings time to conserve energy in factories. What is daylight savings time? That's the thing where you jump ahead an hour or cut back an hour. There's actually a lot of debates to possibly end daylight savings time. Daylight savings time and I'm sorry, the Fuel Administration also encouraged families to take part in heatless Mondays. That's kind of another effort just to preserve energy. We also have the National War Labor Board. This was established to keep strikes from disrupting the war effort. Remember, there's a lot of labor movements going on at the time. Why are there so many strikes at the time? There's really low pay, long hours. Mm, The War Labor Board also mediated labor disputes that would lead to strikes. They also encourage businesses to improve wages, adopt an 8-hour day, and allow collective bargaining. In exchange, labor leaders agreed not to hurt war production with strikes. All right, so today we've got the entry into World War One activity. It's on these industries, so you'll actually be able to fill a lot of it out based on these slides and conversations, but there are also some short readings for you to do to help you to find those answers. So we've got, for example, here the War Industries Board, the sale of Liberty bonds. We didn't talk about that one that much, so you'll have to read a little bit there. The Selective Service Act, again, read. The Espionage Act, the Sedition Act, Schneck versus the United States, and an overarching question. So it's these super short little excerpts. You guys are welcome to work with someone on this, split it up, or work individually if you prefer. I'll give you all the option today because when we have about 20 minutes left, we're going to move on to this ACT reading prep, and you are going to do passage 1 of example test A. Remember the reading passages, the first reading passage is always going to be fiction, prose, poetry, something like that. You only have 8.5 minutes to read that entire first page and then answer 10 questions pertaining to it. So we definitely want to make sure we take some time to practice those skills. And the exit ticket for today is going to be, how did the United States joining World War One impact their foreign policy? Foreign policy is basically how one country relates to other countries. So you should definitely mention neutrality in this answer. That's going to be your hint for that. Thank you all so much for coming to my video today. You might also have the questions in your exit ticket. What events pulled the United States into World War One, and how did the war impact the American home front or society? All right, we'll see you next time.